Have you ever edited a video, exported it, and then uploaded it to YouTube and not liked how it looked on YouTube? Maybe you said something like, my video does not look at all like it looked like on my computer. Why does it look so bad on YouTube? Or have you ever simply wanted to know what settings are best for your videos in order to optimize them for looking the best on YouTube? If you've ever had the experience of it looking bad on YouTube, or you just want to know how to make it look better, today's video is for you. In today's video, I'm going to outline the 5 key settings that you need to know in order to optimize your video for looking its best on YouTube. After I show you these 5 settings, I'm then going to demonstrate how to set up the export in 5 different video editing programs so that you can see a practical step-by-step of how to do it. The 5 programs I'm going to demonstrate today are Adobe Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro, VideoProc Vlogger, and iMovie. So if you use any of those 5 programs, I will give you a clear demonstration of exactly what steps you need to take in order to export using these 5 settings I'm going to show you today. Now, if you find this content helpful as you watch this video, please hit that like button below. It helps me a whole lot. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please hit the subscribe and bell notification button, and you'll be notified every time I publish a new video. Let's get started. The first setting you need to know for optimizing your video for YouTube is the file container, otherwise known as the file extension setting. Now, the hands down best file container for YouTube is MP4. You've probably heard of MP4 before, and you've probably exported a lot of your videos in MP4. The MP4 container can store video, audio, subtitles, and images in separate tracks within that container. And this makes it a great choice for YouTube, and YouTube says MP4 is the preferred option for uploading your videos. The second setting you need to know when optimizing your videos for YouTube is the audio codec. Now, having the proper audio codec is going to be one of the components of helping ensure that you have the best sound possible in your video. If you're doing something with music, that's going to be especially important, but even for vocals, it does help. So the best setting for the audio codec is the AAC-LC codec. This stands for Advanced Audio Codec Low Complexity. The advantage of using the AAC codec is it generally produces higher quality sound at the same bitrate as MP3. In addition, when you're selecting the channels for your output, you want to make sure you always select stereo or stereo 5.1. And if you see a sample rate option, you generally want to select 96 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. Now, something important to know about those is 96 kilohertz is technically a higher quality sound than 48 kilohertz. However, a lot of studies and tests have been done on this, and there's not much of a discernible difference between those two. So if you want to go with the 96, it's great, but if you only have the 48 as an option, don't sweat it. Most people will not be able to hear a difference between those, and if they can hear the difference, for most use cases, it's not going to be a big difference. But if you do have a use case where you want the audio to have that extra edge, I do recommend selecting 96 kilohertz. The third setting you want to know in order to optimize your video for YouTube is the video codec. For the video codec, you want to use H.264. The H.264 video codec offers excellent quality relative to file size, and it is highly compatible with a wide array of devices. When you upload your video with the H.264 codec, it's going to make the processing time a little bit faster than if you had used another type of codec, and it's also going to be faster for YouTube to serve up your video for your audience to watch. The fourth setting, and perhaps one of the most important, is bitrate. Bitrate is one of those key settings for ensuring your video looks good on YouTube. If you have a video you shot on a GoPro, let's say, and let's say the native bitrate was 100 megabits per second, and then you happen to export it in 10 megabits per second, it's going to tend to not look good. It's going to tend to have like these large square pixely patterns in there. If you've ever seen that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's often a beginner mistake simply because a lot of beginners don't know how much the bitrate matters. So bitrate will vary depending on the resolution and frame rate of your finished product. I'm going to outline the optimized bit rates right now. So if you're uploading a 4K video with either a frame rate of 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you're going to want to make sure the bitrate is set to 50 megabits per second. So 50 is kind of that happy medium. The quality is going to look really good. The video is also going to load reasonably fast for your audience. In addition, when you have a bitrate of 50 megabits per second, that's going to help prevent the video file size from becoming too large. Now, if you're uploading a 4K video with a frame rate of 60 frames per second, then you're gonna wanna go a little bit higher with the bitrate because there's more data there. You're gonna generally wanna aim for about 80 megabits per second for a 4K 60 frames per second finished product. Now, if you're uploading a finished product that is a 1080p video with a frame rate of 24 or 30 frames per second, you can go a lot lower with the bitrate and it'll still look good. And that's because the 1080p resolution is a lot smaller resolution than the 4K resolution. There's a lot less pixels there to work with. For 1080p with 24 or 30 frames per second, I recommend a bitrate of 15 megabits per second. If you're uploading a 1080p video with a frame rate of 60 frames per second, I recommend setting the bitrate to 20 megabits per second. Now, speaking of bit rates, for audio bit rates, it's also important that you key in the correct settings. Generally, this is going to default to the proper setting, but I do want to mention it here just in case so that you can verify. Now, for audio bitrate, generally 384 kilobits per second is going to be optimal for normal stereo audio. But if you're doing stereo plus 5.1, then I recommend bumping the audio bitrate up a little bit to 512 kilobits per second. This is going to give you optimal results. The fifth setting that's important to know when exporting for YouTube is the aspect ratio. Generally, the aspect ratio is going to default for you in your video editing software, and it's going to depend on what your timeline settings are. However, in some cases, it doesn't always default, so I do want to mention this so that you can check and verify. The aspect ratio for YouTube should always be 16:9. And what this represents is with 4K, that's going to be a resolution of 3840 by 2160. And for 1080p, it's going to be a resolution of 1920 by 1080. That's going to give you that 16:9 resolution that YouTube wants to see in order to have your video look good. Now that we've gone over those 5 key settings, I'm now going to show you how to adjust these settings in each of the 5 video editing software that I mentioned at the start of this video. Let's start off with Adobe Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro opened here. All right, so let's take a look at these export settings. So as you can see, I've got a project here, and we're gonna do export on this. We're gonna go over here to File, Export. We're gonna click Media. First thing you wanna do up here for format is you wanna select H.264. For preset, you can leave that alone. You don't have to do anything there. For output name, it's a good idea to give it a name. So in this case, I'm gonna do YPO Valley Hike. I'm gonna click Save. And then the next thing you wanna do down here is you wanna make sure your width and your height are set to that. So it's gonna default to that because my timeline is 4K, which is 3840 by 2160. My frame rate is 23.976, which is 24 frames per second. If you're exporting in 30 frames per second, it's gonna do 29.97. And if you're exporting in 60 frames per second, it's gonna say 59.94. If it doesn't have the width and height that you want, then you need to cancel out of this, and you need to go up here and change your sequence settings. You need to make sure it's set to what you want it to be for your export. So we're gonna scroll down here, and I recommend selecting Render at Maximum Depth. That's gonna give you a full quality render on this. It's gonna make sure it's the highest quality. So in this case with 4K, you definitely want it rendered at maximum depth. And when you get down here to bitrate encoding, this is where in Premiere Pro, you wanna select VBR2 pass. It's gonna give you the smoothest, best footage. And for setting the target bitrate, you're gonna put in 50 here for the target, and maximum is gonna default to that. And in this case, since my frame rate is 24 frames per second, the target bitrate is 50. If my frame rate was 60 frames per second, then we'd wanna set this to 80 right here, which all you have to do to set it to 80, just enter in 80, click here. But like I said earlier, if you're doing a 1080p video with a frame rate of 24 or 30, then you can set the bitrate to 15 here. But when you do lower the bitrate, you do have to make sure that the maximum also goes with that. So you'll wanna make sure those are both reading the same. And then of course, if you're doing 1080p with 60 frames per second, the bitrate I recommend setting it at is 20. So anytime the target bitrate is higher than the maximum is gonna come up and meet that. But anytime you set a lower one, the maximum is gonna stay where it is. So I'm gonna put this back to 50 now. And we're gonna scroll down a little bit further. You can leave these settings alone. I do recommend selecting Use Maximum Render Quality here as well. So now we're gonna go up here and we're gonna go over to the Audio tab. So the audio format that we want to have, as I mentioned, is AAC. That is selected by default. The audio codec is AAC. The sample rate, like I said earlier, you have a few options here, but I recommend keeping it at 48,000 Hertz. And then for the channels, you do have the option of stereo or 5.1. I normally default to stereo. And then for the audio bitrate here, it's going to default to 320, which generally is not bad. I do recommend going a little bit higher to 384. 384 is a little bit better than 320, and it doesn't end up increasing your file size by much, if anything. And like I said before, you could go all the way up to 512. If you're doing 5.1 for your channels, then I definitely recommend the 512. But if you're doing just stereo, 384 is going to be more than enough. 512 is not really going to make a difference when it's stereo. And stereo is normally what I default to. So there you go. Those are all of the settings that I plug in here when exporting in Premiere Pro. And once you've done all of that, all you have to do is click export here. It's going to render any files that need rendering, and then it's going to take it away. Next, let's look at how to do this in DaVinci Resolve. All right, so we're going to get DaVinci Resolve opened here. We're going to open up a project at the same height. All right, so to export in DaVinci Resolve, what we're going to do is we're going to come down here once your project's finished, and you're going to click Deliver. Now, DaVinci is different from some of the other video editors in that it has a page dedicated to exporting. So when you click Deliver, you're going to see all of your settings here. What we're going to do is we're going to keep this at custom. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to give your project a name. Then you're going to select a location where you'd like to save it. So in my case, I'm going to select desktop. I'm going to click Save. And so the next thing we want to do here is we want to click where it says Format, and we want to select MP4. Next, we of course want to make sure our codec is set correctly, so you want to make sure it's set to H.264. Generally, it's going to default to this, but you want to make sure. Next, you're going to make sure your resolution is set correctly. So in my case, this is a 4K video, 3840 by 2160 Ultra HD. If you're doing a 1080p video, you're going to select the 1920 by 1080 HD. For the frame rate, this is a 24 frames per second video, so I'm going to keep it set at that. If you're doing 30, you would of course select 30 right there. For quality, it's going to default to automatic, but we want to click here on Restrict. And in this case, I want it set to 50 megabits per second, which in DaVinci Resolve, it measures it in kilobits per second. So we actually want to do 50,000. So that's going to be a 5 with 4 zeros after it. 50,000 kilobits per second is the same as 50 megabits per second. And of course, if you're doing the 1920 by 1080, you're going to put in the 15,000 kilobits per second. And if it's a 60 frames per second with 1080p, you're going to put 20,000. And of course, if it is a 4K with 60 frames per second, you're going to put in 80,000 to represent the 80 megabits per second. But of course, since our frame rate is 24, I'm going to set this back to 50,000. For the encoding profile, you're going to want to make sure that's set to high. For keyframes, just keep that as automatic. Frame reordering, you can just keep that selected. Under advanced settings, you're not going to have to change anything here. That's all going to stay the same. So we're going to minimize that again. And subtitle settings, unless you have subtitles in there, you can leave that as it is. Next, we're going to go over to the audio tab up here, and we're going to make sure the codec is set correctly to AAC. It is. For the data rate, we're going to leave that there. The bit depth, we're going to leave that alone as well. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to click Add to Render Queue, and it's going to show up here in your queue, and you're going to click Render All. All right, our render is complete. Completed in 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Next, we're going to take a look at how to do this in Final Cut Pro. Once we're in Final Cut Pro, we've got our project right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to the upper right, and we're going to click on this button. When you hover over it, it's going to say Share the Project Event Clipper Timeline Range. We're going to click here, and we're going to select Export File Default. What that's going to do is it's going to bring up this window right here. And we want to verify our settings down here, that it's all set correctly. So our timeline is 3840 by 2160, which is 4K. And the frame rate is 23.98, which is 24 frames per second. So we're going to go over here to settings. And for format, we want to make sure that's selected with computer. And for video codec, we want to make sure it's set to H.264 better quality. For resolution, it's 4K, so we want 3840 by 2160. If it's a 1080p project, then you want to select 1920 by 1080. Down here for the color space, we're going to leave that, and the audio format, it defaults as well to AAC. For the action, we want it to say save only. And then when you look under roles here, it's going to confirm that it's an MP4 file, one file, video track, all video, audio track, all dialogue, and everything looks good there. So we're going to go back here and we're going to click next, and we're going to give it a title. Then we're going to click save, and it's going to start exporting. And if you want to see the status of the export, you can click right up here on the background task. And that's going to show it right down here under the sharing tab. And that is how you export in Final Cut Pro. Now let's take a look at how to do this in VideoProc Vlogger. We're going to open up VideoProc Vlogger. And we're going to open the project here. And in order to export in VideoProc, we're going to go right over here where it says export. In particular, I do like this VideoProc menu. It's simple, but it has all of the settings we need right here in an easy to view and understand sort of way. So props to VideoProc for it being a free product. It does have a good layout. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to put in the file name that we'd like to name our finished product. It's going to want to navigate to where you'd like to save it. We're going to save it to desktop. For format, make sure this is MP4. You do have a couple other options, but MP4 is what you want to select. And it does say the most widely used format, which is correct. Next, for the quality here, you can select high and just keep this at 4 for now. I'll show you why. Once you set the bitrate down here, that's going to control the quality more so than this. So this up here doesn't really matter unless you wanted this to be a default. So for video codec, you're going to make sure it says H.264, which in this case, it's going to say AVC in front of that. For frames per second, this project is 24 frames per second, so we're going to keep it at 24. If it's 30 or 60, you can select that down here, which by the way, it doesn't really matter if you select 23.976 or 24. The same thing for 30. If you select 29.97 or 30, they are essentially the same. There's a slight difference, but it's not going to matter for the sake of what you're doing for YouTube. For bitrate, you're going to select constant here. And in this case, since it is a 4K, 24 frames per second video, we're going to put the bitrate as 50,000 kilobits per second. 50,000 is equivalent to 50 megabits per second. And if you had the 1080p with 24 frames per second, you would put this at 15,000, which would equal to 15 megabits per second. And if you had the 1080p with 60 frames per second, you're going to put this at 20,000, which will equal 20 megabits per second. So I'm going to change this back to 50,000 since it is 4K 24 frames per second. Down here for the audio codec, you want to make sure that's selected at AAC. For the sample rate, you can keep it at 44,100 or 48,000, but definitely have it at least 44,100. In this case, I am going to select the 48,000 hertz. For the audio channels, this does just offer 2 options in this software, mono or stereo. You want to make sure it's set to stereo. For bitrate, VideoProc Vlogger does only allow it to go up to 160 kilobits per second, so select that. In this case, that is the highest that's offered. And you're going to keep Enable Hardware Acceleration for Encoding selected, and then you're going to hit Start. And down here, it's going to show the progress, and it's going to show you your remaining time. And that is how you do an export in VideoProc Vlogger. Finally, let's take a look at how to export with these settings in iMovie. All right, let's open up iMovie. Got our project on the timeline here. And in order to export, this is going to actually be very similar to Final Cut Pro. You're going to go up here to the upper right, and you're going to click the share button right here. And you're going to click on export file. And then it's going to bring up this dialog right here. And for the format, we want to have video and audio because we want it to export both. For resolution, we're going to change this to 4K because it is a 4K video and a 4K timeline. If you're doing 1080p, you'll keep it at 1080p. For the quality, we want to select custom. And in iMovie, it actually lets you adjust the bitrate pretty easily here. So in this case, it's a 4K 24 frames per second video. So I'm going to drag this right about to 50 megabits per second. If you don't have it exactly at 50, that's fine. It's not going to be a big deal. Of course, if it's a 60 frame per second 4K video, we're going to drag this all the way up. But it will not go to 80. The highest it'll go is 66.667. So we're going to leave it at that. If it is a 1080p video and it's 24 or 30 frames per second, you would drag this down to about 15 megabits per second. And if it's 1080 with 60 frames per second, you're going to drag this up to about 20. But since this is 4K 24 frames per second, we're going to take it back to 50. And for compress, we're going to do better quality. And we're going to click next. It's going to let you give your file a save as name. So we're going to call it Hawaii Hike. And I'm going to save it to my desktop. And it's going to begin rendering. And up here, you're going to be able to see your status. You can click on Show Activity. And it's going to give you a time estimate here. And it's going to continue to show the status right here. And that is how you export in iMovie with all of the best settings. So I hope you found this video to be helpful in understanding how to optimize your videos for YouTube uploading. By using these export settings, you'll be able to ensure that your video on YouTube looks just as good as it looks on your computer. Until we talk again, happy video editing.